Chapter 25 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 4. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 4 by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Chapter 25. The Army of the Potomac. On the day after the Battle of Bull Run, General McClellan was ordered to Washington. He arrived there on the 26th of July, and the next day assumed command of the Division of the Potomac, comprising the troops in and around Washington on both sides of the river. In his general report, dated August 4, 1863, he says, "When I assumed command in Washington on the 27th of July, 1861, the number of troops in and around the city was about 50,000 infantry, less than 1,000 cavalry, and 650 artillerymen, with 9 imperfect field batteries of 30 pieces. There was nothing to prevent the enemy shelling the city from heights within easy range, which could be occupied by a hostile column almost without resistance. Many soldiers had deserted, and the streets of Washington were crowded with straggling officers and men, absent from their stations without authority, whose behavior indicated the general want of discipline and organization." This picture is naturally drawn in the darkest colors, but the outlines are substantially accurate. There was great need of everything which goes to the efficiency of an army. There was need of soldiers, of organization, of drill, of a young and vigorous commander to give impulse and direction to the course of affairs. All these wants were speedily supplied. The energy of the government and the patriotism of the North poured into the capital a constant stream of recruits. These were taken in hand by an energetic and intelligent staff, assigned to brigades and divisions, equipped and drilled with the greatest order and celerity. The infantry levies, on their first arrival, were sent to the various camps in the suburbs, and being there formed into provisional brigades, were thoroughly exercised and instructed before being transferred to the forces on the other side of the river. These provisional brigades were successively commanded by Generals Fitz-John Porter, Ambrose E. Burnside, and Silas Casey. The cavalry and artillery, as they arrived, reported respectively to Generals George Stoneman and William F. Berry, chiefs of those arms. Colonel Andrew Porter was made Provost Marshal of Washington, and soon reduced the place to perfect order, which was not again disturbed during the war. Deserters were arrested, stragglers sent back to their regiments, and the streets rendered more quiet and secure than those of most cities in profound peace. A great army was speedily formed. The 50,000 that General McClellan found in Washington were reinforced by the stalwart men of the North as fast as steam could bring them by water and land. Nothing like it had ever before been seen on this continent. The grand total of officers and men of the regular army before the war consisted of 17,000 souls. On the 27th of October, exactly 3 months after General McClellan assumed command, he reported an aggregate of strength for the army under him of 168,318, of which there were, he said, present for duty 147,695, and he reported several other bodies of troops en route to him. The Adjutant General's report 3 days later shows present for duty with the Army of the Potomac, inclusive of troops in the lower Shenandoah and at Washington, 162,737, with an aggregate present and absent of 198,238. This vast army was of the best material the country could afford. The 3-months regiments, which were as a rule imperfectly organized and badly officered, their officers being to great extent the product of politics and personal influence, had been succeeded by the volunteer army of 3 years' men, which contained all the best elements of the militia, with very desirable additions. Only the most able of the militia generals, those whom the President had recognized as worthy of permanent employment, returned to the field after the expiration of their 3-months' service. The militia organization of brigades and divisions had of course disappeared. The governors of the states organized the regiments, and appointed regimental and company officers only. The higher organization rested with the President, who also had the appointing of general and staff officers. A most valuable element of the new army was the old regular organization, largely increased and improved by the addition of 11 regiments, constituting 2 divisions of 2 brigades each. This created a great many additional vacancies, which were filled partly from the old army and partly from civil life, giving to the service a large number of valuable officers. 2 classes of cadets were that year graduated from the military academy at West Point, many of whom became useful and distinguished in the regular and the volunteer service. In brief, for 3 months, the government placed at the disposal of the young general more than a regiment a day of excellent troops. The best equipments, the best arms, the best artillery, the most distinguished of the old officers, the most promising of the young, were given him. The armies in every other part of the country were stinted to supply this most important of all the departments, and at first it was with universal popular assent that this bountiful provision was made for him. He had gained for the Union the only victory it had yet to its credit. He enjoyed a high character for military learning and science, founded upon the report of his friends. He was capable of great and long-continued industry in executive affairs. He was surrounded by an able and brilliant staff, all heartily devoted to him, and inclined to give him the greater share of the credit for their own work. His alert and gallant bearing as he rode from camp to camp about Washington, surrounded by a company of aides in uniforms as yet untarnished by campaign life, impressed the imagination of tourists and newspaper correspondents, who at once gave him, on this insufficient evidence, the sobriquet of the young Napoleon. In addition to these advantages, he was a man of extraordinary personal attractiveness. Strangers instinctively liked him, and those who were thrown much in his company grew very fond of him. In every one, from the President of the United States to the humblest orderly who waited at his door, he inspired a remarkable affection and regard, a part of which sprang, it is true, from the intense desire prevalent at the time for success to our arms, which naturally included an impulse of goodwill to our foremost military leaders. But this impulse, in the case of General McClellan, was given a peculiar warmth by his unusually winning personal characteristics. In consequence, he was courted and caressed as few men in our history have been. His charm of manner, enhanced by his rising fame, made him the idol of the Washington drawing rooms, and his high official position, his certainty of speedy promotion to supreme command, and the probability of great political influence to follow, made him the target of all the interests and ambitions that center in a capital in time of war. He can hardly be blamed if this sudden and dazzling elevation produced some effect upon his character and temper. Suddenly, as by a spell of enchantment, he had been put in command of one of the greatest armies of modern times. He had become one of the most conspicuous figures of the world. His portrait had grown as familiar as those of our great historic worthies. Every word and act of his were taken up and spread broadcast by the 1,000 tongues of publicity. He saw himself treated with the utmost deference, his prejudices flattered, and his favor courted by statesmen and soldiers twice his age. We repeat that he can hardly be blamed if his temper and character suffered in the ordeal. He has left in his memoirs and letters unquestionable evidence of a sudden and fatal degeneration of mind during the months he passed in Washington in the latter half of 1861. At first everything was novel and delightful. On the 27th of July he wrote, "I find myself in a new and strange position here, President, Cabinet, General Scott, and all deferring to me. By some strange operation of magic, I seem to have become the power of the land." 3 days later he wrote, "They give me my way in everything, full swing and unbounded confidence. Who would have thought, when we were married, that I should so soon be called upon to save my country?" A few days afterwards, "I shall carry this thing on en grand, and crush the rebels in one campaign." By the 9th of August, his estimate of his own importance had taken such a morbid development that he was able to say, "I would cheerfully take the dictatorship and agree to lay down my life when the country is saved." Yet he added in the same letter, "I am not spoiled by my unexpected new position." This pleasing delirium lasted only a few weeks, and was succeeded by a strange and permanent hallucination upon 2 points. One was that the enemy, whose numbers were about 1/3 his own, vastly exceeded his army in strength, and the other that the government, which was doing everything in its power to support him, was hostile to him and desired his destruction. On the 16th of August he wrote, "I am here in a terrible place. The enemy have from 3 to 4 times my force. The President, the old general, cannot or will not see the true state of affairs." He was in terror for fear he should be attacked, in doubt whether his army would stand. "If my men will only fight, I think I can thrash him, notwithstanding the disparity of numbers. I am weary of all this." Later on the same day he wrote with exultation, "Providence is aiding me by heavy rains which are swelling the Potomac, which may be impassable for a week. If so, we are saved." All through the month he expected battle in a week. By the end of August his panic passed away. He said he was ready for Beauregard, and a week later began to talk of attacking him. By this time he had become, to use his own language, disgusted with this administration, perfectly sick of it. His intimate friends and associates were among the political opponents of the men at the head of affairs, and their daily flatteries had easily convinced him that in him was the only hope of saving the country, in spite of its incapable rulers. He says in one place, with singular naivete, that Mr. Stanton gained his confidence by professing friendship for him while loading the President with abuse and ridicule. He professed a special contempt for the President, partly because Mr. Lincoln showed him too much deference. In October he wrote, "There are some of the greatest geese in the cabinet I have ever seen, enough to tax the patience of Job." In November his disgust at the government had become almost intolerable. "It is sickening in the extreme, and makes me feel heavy at heart when I see the weakness and unfitness of the poor beings who control the destinies of this great country." The affair of Mason and Slidell, with which he had no concern and upon which his advice was not asked, agitated him at this time. He felt that his wisdom alone must save the country in this crisis. He wrote that he must spend the day in trying to get the government to do its duty. He did not quite know what its duty was, but must first go to Stanton's to ascertain what the law of nations had to say on the matter, Stanton being at this time his friend, and, as he thought, Lincoln's opponent. He had begun already to rank the President as among his enemies. He was in the habit of hiding at Stanton's when he had serious work to do, to dodge, as he said, all enemies in the shape of browsing presidents, etc. "I am thwarted and deceived by these incapables at every turn." He soon began to call and to consider the Army of the Potomac as his own. He assumed the habit, which he never relinquished, of asking that all desirable troops and stores be sent to him. Indeed, it may be observed that even before he came to Washington this tendency was discernible. While he remained in the West, he was continually asking for men and money. But when he came to the Potomac, he recognized no such need on the part of his successor, and telegraphed to Governor Dennison to pay no attention to Rosecrans's demand for reinforcements. In the plan of campaign which he laid before the President on the 4th of August, 1861, which was, in general objects and intentions, very much the same plan already adopted by General Scott and the government, he assigned the scantiest detachments to the great work of conquering the Mississippi Valley. 20,000, he thought, would be enough, with what could be raised in Kentucky and Tennessee, to secure the latter region and its railroads, as well as ultimately to occupy Nashville, while he demanded for himself the enormous aggregate of 273,000 men. He wanted especially all the regular troops. The success of operations elsewhere, he said, was relatively unimportant compared with those in Virginia. These views of his were naturally adopted by his immediate associates, who carried them to an extreme probably not contemplated by the general. They seemed to regard him as a kind of tribune, armed by the people with powers independent of and superior to the civil authorities. On the 20th of August, his father-in-law, Colonel R.B. Marcy, being in New York, and not being satisfied with what he saw in the way of recruitment, sent General McClellan a telegram urging him to make a positive and unconditional demand for an immediate draft of the additional troops you require. "The people," he says, "will applaud such a course, rely upon it." The general, seeing nothing out of the way in this explosive communication of his staff officer, sent it to the Secretary of War with this endorsement: "Colonel Marcy knows what he says, and is of the coolest judgment," and recommended that his suggestion be carried into effect. All this time every avenue of transportation was filled with soldiers on their way to Washington. In connection with his delusion as to the number of the enemy in front of him, it grew a fixed idea in his mind that all the best troops and all the officers of ability in the army should be placed under his orders. On the 8th of September he wrote a remarkable letter to the Secretary of War embodying these demands. He began, in the manner which at an early day became habitual with him and continued to the end of his military career, by enormously exaggerating the strength of the enemy opposed to him. He reports his own force in the immediate vicinity of Washington at 85,000, and that of the enemy at 130,000, which he says is a low estimate, and draws the inevitable conclusion that this army should be reinforced at once by all the disposable troops that the East and West and North can furnish. "I would also urgently recommend," he says, "that the whole of the regular army, old and new, be at once ordered to report here, with some trifling exceptions." He also demanded that the choicest officers be assigned to him, especially that none of those recommended by him should be sent anywhere else. Most of these requests were granted, and General McClellan seems to have assumed a sort of proprietary right over every regiment that had once come under his command. When General Thomas W. Sherman's expedition was about sailing for Port Royal, he made an earnest request to the government for the 79th New York Highlanders. The matter being referred to General McClellan, he wrote in the most peremptory tone to the War Department, forbidding the detachment of those troops. "I will not consent," he says roundly, "to one other man being detached from this army for that expedition. I need far more than I now have to save this country. It is the task of the Army of the Potomac to decide the question at issue." The President accepted this rebuke, and telegraphed to General Sherman that he had promised General McClellan not to break his army here without consent. But the regiment was afterwards sent to Sherman. Such an attitude towards the military and civil authorities has rarely been assumed by a general so young and so inexperienced, and to sustain it requires a degree of popular strength and confidence which is only gained by rapid and brilliant successes. In the case of General McClellan, the faith of his friends and of the government had no nourishment for a long time except his own promises, and several incidents during the late summer and autumn made heavy drafts upon the general confidence which was accorded him. From the beginning of hostilities, the blockade of the Potomac River below Washington was recognized on both sides as a great advantage to be sought by the Confederates, and a great danger to be guarded against by the national government. For a while the Navy had been able to keep the waters of the river clear by the employment of a few powerful light draft steamers, but it soon became evident that this would not permanently be a sufficient protection, and even before the Battle of Bull Run the Navy Department suggested a combined occupation by the Army and the Navy of Matthias Point, a bold and commanding promontory on the Virginia side, where the Potomac, after a horseshoe bend to the east, flows southward again, with its width greatly increased. On the 20th of August, the Navy Department renewed its importunities to the War Department to cooperate in the seizure of this most important point, which was absolutely essential to the unobstructed navigation of the Potomac. 11 days later these suggestions were still more pressingly presented without effect. In October, however, when rebel batteries were already appearing at different points on the river, and when it was in contemplation to send to Port Royal the steamers which had been policing the Potomac, an arrangement was entered into between the Army and the Navy to occupy Matthias Point. Orders were sent to Captain Thomas T. Craven to collect at that place the necessary boats for landing a force of 4,000 men. He waited all night, and no troops appeared. Captain Gustavus V. Fox, the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, who had taken a great deal of interest in the expedition, went in deep chagrin to the President, who at once accompanied him to General McClellan's quarters to ask some explanation of this failure. The general informed him that he had become convinced it would not be practicable to land the troops, and that he had therefore not sent them. Captain Fox assured him that the Navy would be responsible for that, and after some discussion it was concluded that the troops should go the next night. Captain Craven was again ordered to be in readiness. The troops did not go. Craven came to Washington in great agitation, threw up his command, and applied for sea service on the ground that his reputation as an officer would be ruined by the closing of the river while he was in command of the flotilla. The vessels went out one by one, the rebels put up their batteries at their leisure, and the blockade of the river was complete. When General McClellan was examined as to this occurrence by the Committee of the Conduct of the War, he did not remember the specific incidents as recited by Captain Fox, and as reported above, but he said he never regarded the obstruction of the Potomac as of vital importance. Its importance was more moral than physical. General McClellan was perhaps inclined to underrate moral effects. The affair at Ball's Bluff, which occurred on the 21st of October, produced an impression on the public mind and affected his relations with the leading spirits in Congress to an extent entirely out of proportion to its intrinsic importance. He had hitherto enjoyed unbounded popularity. The country saw the army rapidly growing in numbers and improving in equipment and discipline, and was content to allow the authorities their own time for accomplishing their purposes. The general looked forward to no such delays as afterwards seemed to him necessary. He even assumed that the differences between himself and General Scott arose from Scott's preference for inaction and the defensive. On the 10th of October he said to the President, "I think we shall have our arrangements made for a strong reconnaissance about Monday to feel the strength of the enemy. I intend to be careful and do as well as possible. Don't let them hurry me is all I ask." The President, pleased with the prospect of action, replied, "You shall have your own way in the matter, I assure you." On the 12th he sent a dispatch to Mr. Lincoln from the front, saying that the enemy was before him in force and would probably attack in the morning. "If they attack," he added, "I shall beat them." Nothing came of this. On the 16th the President was, as usual, at headquarters for a moment's conversation with General McClellan, who informed him that the enemy was massing at Manassas, and said that he was not such a fool as to buck against that place in the spot designated by the rebels. But he seemed continually to be waiting merely for some slight additional increment of his force, and never intending any long postponement of the offensive, while he was apparently always ready and even desirous for the enemy to leave their works and attack him, being confident of defeating them. In this condition of affairs, with all his force well in hand, he ordered, on the 19th of October, that General George A. McCall should march from his camp at Langley to Drainesville to cover a somewhat extensive series of reconnaissances for the purpose of learning the position of the enemy, and of protecting the operations of the topographical engineers in making maps of that region. The next day he received a dispatch from General Banks's adjutant general indicating that the enemy had moved away from Leesburg. This information turned out to be erroneous, but upon receiving it, General McClellan sent a telegram to General Charles P. Stone at Poolesville, informing him that General McCall had occupied Drainesville the day before and was still there, that heavy reconnaissances would be sent out the same day in all directions from that point, and directing General Stone to keep a good lookout upon Leesburg, to see if that movement had the effect to drive them away. "Perhaps," he adds, "a slight demonstration on your part would have the effect to move them." General McClellan afterwards insisted that this order contemplated nothing more than that General Stone should make some display of an intention to cross, and should watch the enemy more closely than usual. But General Stone gave it a wider range, and at once reported to General McClellan that he had made a feint of crossing at Poolesville, and had at the same time started a reconnoitering party towards Leesburg from Harrison's Island, and that the enemy's pickets had retired to their entrenchments. Although General McClellan afterwards virtually held that this was in effect a disobedience of his orders, he did not direct General Stone to retire his troops. On the contrary, he congratulated him upon the movement, but thinking that McCall would not be needed to cooperate with Stone, he ordered the former to fall back from Drainesville to his camp near Prospect Hill, which order, though contradicted by later instructions which did not reach him until his return to Langley, was executed during the morning of the 21st. But while McCall, having completed his reconnaissance, was marching at his leisure back to his camp, the little detachment which General Stone had sent across the river had stumbled upon a battle. A careful reading of the official accounts relating to this affair affords the best possible illustration of the lack of discipline and intelligent organization prevailing at that time in both armies. The reports of the two different commanders seem hardly to refer to the same engagement. Each side enormously exaggerates the strength of the enemy, and the descriptions of the carnage at critical moments of the fight read absurdly enough when compared with the meager official lists of killed and wounded. We will briefly state what really took place. On the evening of October 20th, General Willis A. Gorman made a demonstration of crossing at Edwards Ferry, and a scouting party of the 15th Massachusetts crossed from Harrison's Island and went to within about a mile of Leesburg, returning with the report that they had found a small camp of the enemy in the woods. General Stone then ordered Colonel Charles Devens, commanding the 15th Massachusetts, to take 5 companies of his regiment over in the night to destroy this camp at daybreak. Colonel Devens, proceeding to execute this order, found that the statement of the scouting party was erroneous, and reporting this fact, waited in the woods for further orders. General Stone sent over the rest of the regiment, and later the 20th Massachusetts, Colonel William Raymond Lee, and Colonel Milton Cogswell's Tammany Regiment, the whole being under the command of Colonel E. D. Baker of the California Regiment, 71st Pennsylvania, a senator from Oregon, an officer of the highest personal and political distinction, and as we have already related, not without experience in the Mexican War. General Stone had now evidently resolved upon a reconnaissance in force, and in case an engagement should result, he confidently expected Colonel Baker to drive the enemy from his front, at which juncture General Stone expected to come in upon their right with Gorman's troops, which he was pushing over at Edwards Ferry, and capture or rout the entire command. He gave Colonel Baker discretionary authority to advance or to retire after crossing the river, as circumstances might seem to dictate. Colonel Baker entered upon the work assigned to him with the greatest enthusiasm and intrepidity. The means of transportation were lamentably inadequate, but working energetically, though without system, the greater part of the troops assigned for the service were at last got over the river, and Baker took command on the field about 2 o'clock. The battle was already lost, though the brave and high-spirited orator did not suspect it, any more than did General Stone, who, at Edwards Ferry, was waiting for the moment to arrive when he should attack the enemy's right, and convert his defeat into rout. General Devens, who had been skirmishing briskly with continually increasing numbers of the Confederates all the morning, had by this time fallen back in line with Baker's, William R. Lee's, and Milton Cogswell's regiments, and a new disposition was made of all the troops on the ground to resist the advancing enemy. The disposition was as bad as could have been made. Both flanks were exposed, and the reserves were placed in an unprotected position immediately in rear of the center, where they were shot down without resistance, and were only dangerous to their comrades in front of them. Colonel Baker, whose bravery marked him for destruction, was killed about 4 o'clock, being struck at the same moment by several bullets while striving to encourage his men, and after a brief and ineffectual effort by Colonel Cogswell to move to the left, the National troops retreated to the river bank. They were closely followed by the Confederates. The wretched boats into which many of them rushed were swamped. A few strong swimmers reached the Maryland shore, some were shot in the water, a large number threw their arms into the stream, and, dispersing in the bushes, escaped in the twilight, but a great part of the entire command was captured. The losses on the Union side were 49 killed, 158 wounded, and 714 missing. The Confederate loss in killed and wounded was almost as great, 33 killed and 115 wounded and missing. As soon as the news of the disaster reached General Stone, he hurried to the right, where the fugitives from the right were arriving, did what he could to reestablish order there, and sent instructions to Gorman to entrench himself at Edwards Ferry and act on the defensive. General Banks came up with reinforcements at 3 o'clock in the morning of the 22nd and assumed command. The Confederates made an attack upon Gorman the same day and were easily repulsed. But General McClellan, thinking that the enemy were strengthening themselves at Leesburg and that our means of crossing and recrossing were very insufficient, withdrew all the troops to the Maryland side. It seems from the Confederate reports that he was mistaken in concluding that the enemy were strengthening themselves. They were also getting out of harm's way as rapidly as possible. General Nathan G. Evans, their commander, says, "Finding my brigade very much exhausted, I left Colonel Barksdale with his regiment, with 2 pieces of artillery and a cavalry force, as a grand guard, and I ordered the other 3 regiments to fall back towards Carter's Mill, to rest and to be collected in order." The utter inadequacy of means for crossing was of course a sufficient reason to justify the cessation of active operations at that time and place. Insignificant as was this engagement in itself, it was of very considerable importance in immediate effect and ultimate results. It was the occasion of enormous encouragement to the South. The reports of the Confederate officers exaggerated their own prowess, and the numbers and losses of the National troops tenfold. General Beauregard, in his congratulatory order of October 23rd, claimed that the result of this action proved that no disparity of numbers could avail anything as against Southern valor, assisted by the manifest aid of the God of battles. But there, as at Bull Run, the number engaged and the aggregate killed and wounded were about equal on both sides, a fact clearly shown by the respective official records. At the North, the gloom and affliction occasioned by the defeat were equally out of proportion to the event. Among the killed and wounded were several young men of brilliant promise and distinguished social connections in New England, and the useless sacrifice of their lives made a deep impression upon wide circles of friends and kindred. The death of Colonel Baker greatly affected the public mind. He had been little known in the East when he came as senator from Oregon, but from the moment that he began to appear in public, his fluent and impassioned oratory, his graceful and dignified bearing, a certain youthful energy and fire which contrasted pleasantly with his silver hair, had made him extremely popular with all classes. He was one of Mr. Lincoln's dearest friends. He was especially liked in the Senate. He was one of the most desirable and effective speakers at great mass meetings. A cry of passionate anger went up from every part of the country over this precious blood wasted, this dishonor inflicted upon the national flag. The first and most available scapegoat was, naturally enough, General Stone. He cannot be acquitted of all responsibility, even in the calmest review of the facts. There was a lack of preparation for the fight, a lack of thorough supervision after it had begun. But these were the least of the charges made against him. The suspicion which civil war always breeds, and the calumnies resulting from them, were let loose upon him. They grew to such proportions by constant repetition during the autumn and winter following that many people actually thought he was one of a band of conspirators in the Union Army working in the interest of rebellion. This impression seized upon the minds of some of the most active and energetic men in Congress, friends and associates of Colonel Baker. They succeeded in convincing the Secretary of War that General Stone was dangerous to the public welfare, and on the 28th of January an order was issued from the War Department to General McClellan directing him to arrest General Stone. He kept it for several days without executing it, but at last, being apparently impressed by the evidence of a refugee from Leesburg that there was some foundation for the charges made by the Committee of Congress, he ordered the arrest of General Stone, saying at the same time to the Secretary of War that the case was too indefinite to warrant the framing of charges. The arrest was made without consulting the President. When Mr. Stanton announced it to him, the President said, "I suppose you have good reasons for it, and having good reasons, I am glad I knew nothing of it until it was done." General Stone was taken to Fort Lafayette, where he remained in confinement 6 months. He was then released and afterwards restored to duty, but never received any satisfaction in answer to his repeated demands for reparation or trial. For the moment at least, there seemed no disposition to censure General McClellan for this misfortune. Indeed, it was only a few days after the Battle of Ball's Bluff that he gained his final promotion to the chief command of the armies of the United States. A brief review of his relations to his predecessor, General Scott, may be necessary to a proper understanding of the circumstances under which he succeeded to the supreme command. Their intercourse, at first marked by great friendship, had soon become clouded by misunderstandings. The veteran had always had a high regard for his junior, had sent him hearty congratulations upon his appointment to command the Ohio Volunteers, and although he had felt compelled on one occasion to rebuke him for interference with matters beyond his jurisdiction, their relations remained perfectly friendly, and the old general warmly welcomed the young one to Washington. But once there, General McClellan began to treat the general-in-chief with a neglect which, though probably unintentioned, was none the less galling. On the 8th of August, General McClellan sent to General Scott a letter to the effect that he believed the capital not only insecure but in imminent danger. As General McClellan never personally communicated these views to his chief, but had, as Scott says, propagated them in high quarters so that they had come indirectly to the old general's ears, his temper, which was never one of the meekest, quite gave way, and declining to answer General McClellan's letter, he addressed an angry note to the Secretary of War, scouting the idea of Washington being in danger, calling attention to the stream of new regiments that is pouring in upon us, complaining bitterly of the reticence and neglect with which his junior treated him, and begging the President, as soon as possible, to retire him from the active command of the army for which his age, his wounds, and his infirmities had unfitted him. Mr. Lincoln was greatly distressed by this altercation between the two officers. He prevailed upon General McClellan to write him a conciliatory note, withdrawing the letter of the 8th, and armed with this, he endeavored to soothe the irritation of Scott, and to induce him to withdraw his angry rejoinder of the 9th. But youth, sure of itself and the future, forgives more easily than age, and Scott refused, respectfully but firmly, to comply with the President's request. He waited 2 days and wrote again to the Secretary of War, giving his reasons for his refusal. He believed General McClellan had deliberately, and with the advice of certain members of the Cabinet, offended him by the letter in question, and that for the last week, though many regiments had arrived and several more or less important movements of troops had taken place, General McClellan had reported nothing to him, but had been frequently in conversation with various high officers of the government. That freedom of access and consultation, he continued, have very naturally deluded the junior general into a feeling of indifference towards his senior. He argued that it would be against the dignity of his years to be filing daily complaints against an ambitious junior, and closed by reiterating his own unfitness for command. The two generals never became reconciled. The bickerings between them continued for 2 months, marked with a painful and growing bitterness on the part of Scott, and on the part of McClellan by a neglect akin to contempt. The elder officer, galled by his subordinate's persistent disrespect, published a general order on the 16th of September, which he said was intended to suppress an irregularity more conspicuous in Major General McClellan than in any other officer, forbidding junior officers on duty from corresponding with their superiors except through intermediate commanders, the same rule applying to correspondence with the President and the Secretary of War, unless by the President's request. General McClellan showed how little he cared for such an order by writing 2 important letters to the Secretary of War within 3 days after it was issued. On the same day a special order was given General McClellan to report to Army Headquarters the number and position of troops under his command, to which order he paid no attention whatever. General Scott felt himself helpless in the face of this mute and persistent disobedience, but he was not able to bear it in silence. On the 4th of October he addressed another passionate remonstrance to the Secretary of War, setting forth these facts, asking whether there were no remedy for such offenses, adverting once more to his physical infirmities, and at last divulging the true reason why he had borne so long the contumely of his junior, that he was only awaiting the arrival of General Halleck, whose presence would give him increased confidence in the preservation of the Union, and thus permit him to retire. On the 31st of October he took his final resolution, and addressed the following letter to the Secretary of War. For more than 3 years I have been unable, from a hurt, to mount a horse or to walk more than a few paces at a time, and that with much pain. Other and new infirmities, dropsy and vertigo, admonish me that repose of mind and body, with the appliances of surgery and medicine, are necessary to add a little more to a life already protracted much beyond the usual span of man. It is under such circumstances, made doubly painful by the unnatural and unjust rebellion now raging in the Southern States of our so late prosperous and happy Union, that I am compelled to request that my name be placed on the list of Army officers retired from active service. As this request is founded on an absolute right granted by a recent act of Congress, I am entirely at liberty to say it is with deep regret that I withdraw myself in these momentous times from the order of a President who has treated me with distinguished kindness and courtesy, whom I know among much personal intercourse to be patriotic without sectional partialities or prejudices, to be highly conscientious in the performance of every duty, and of unrivaled activity and perseverance. And to you, Mr. Secretary, whom I now officially address for the last time, I beg to acknowledge my many obligations for the uniform high consideration I have received in your hands. His request was granted, with the usual compliments and ceremonies, the President and Cabinet waiting upon him in person at his residence. General McClellan succeeded him in command of the armies of the United States, and in his order of the 1st of November he praised in swelling periods the war-worn veteran whose latest days of service he had so annoyed and embittered. When we consider the relative positions of the two officers, the years, the infirmities, the well-earned glory of Scott, his former friendship and kindness towards his junior, and, on the other hand, the youth, the strength, the marvelous good fortune of McClellan, his great promotion, his certainty of almost immediate succession to supreme command, it cannot be said that his demeanor towards his chief was magnanimous. Although General Scott's unfitness for command had become obvious, although his disposition, which in his youth had been arrogant and haughty, had been modified but not improved by age into irascibility, it would certainly not have been out of place for his heir presumptive to dissemble an impatience which was not unnatural, and preserve some appearance at least of a respect he did not feel. Standing in the full sunshine, there was something due from him to an old and illustrious soldier stepping reluctantly into hopeless shadow. The change was well received in all parts of the country. At Washington there was an immediate feeling of relief. The President called at General McClellan's headquarters on the night of the 1st of November and gave him warm congratulations. "I should feel perfectly satisfied," he said, "if I thought that this vast increase of responsibility would not embarrass you." "It is a great relief, sir," McClellan answered. "I feel as if several tons were taken from my shoulders today. I am now in contact with you and the Secretary. I am not embarrassed by intervention." "Very well," said the President. "Draw on me for all the sense and information I have. In addition to your present command, the supreme command of the Army will entail an enormous labor upon you." "I can do it all," McClellan quickly answered. 10 days later, Blenkner's brigade organized a torchlight procession in honor of the event. The President, after the show was over, went as usual to General McClellan's, and referring to the Port Royal expedition, thought this a good time to feel the enemy. "I have not been unmindful of that," McClellan answered. "We shall feel them tomorrow." Up to this time there was no importunity on the part of the President for an advance of the army, although for several weeks some of the leading men in Congress had been urging it. As early as the 26th of October, Senators Trumbull, Chandler, and Wade called upon the President and earnestly represented to him the importance of immediate action. 2 days later they had another conference with the President and Mr. Seward at the house of the latter. They spoke with some vehemence of the absolute necessity for energetic measures to drive the enemy from in front of Washington. The President and the Secretary of State both defended McClellan in his deliberate purpose not to move until he was ready. The zealous senators did not confine their visits to the civil authorities. They called upon General McClellan also, and in the course of an animated conversation Mr. Wade said an unsuccessful battle was preferable to delay. Defeat would be easily repaired by the swarming recruits, a thrust which McClellan neatly parried by saying he would rather have a few recruits before a victory than a good many after a defeat. There was as yet no apparent hostility to McClellan, even among "these wretched politicians," as he calls them. On the contrary, this conference of the 26th was not inharmonious. McClellan represented General Scott as the obstacle to immediate action, and skillfully diverted the zeal of the senators against the General-in-Chief. He wrote that night, "For the last 3 hours I have been at Montgomery Blair's talking with Senators Wade, Trumbull, and Chandler about war matters. They will make a desperate effort tomorrow to have General Scott retired at once. Until that is accomplished I can effect but little good. He is ever in my way, and I am sure does not desire effective action." The President, while defending the general from the strictures of the senators, did not conceal from McClellan the fact of their urgency. He told him it was a reality not to be left out of the account. At the same time, he was not to fight till he was ready. "I have everything at stake," the general replied. "If I fail, I will never see you again." At this period there was no question of more than a few days' delay. The friendly visits of the President to Army headquarters were continued almost every night until the 13th of November, when an incident occurred which virtually put an end to them. On that evening Mr. Lincoln walked across the street as usual, accompanied by one of his household, to the residence of the Secretary of State, and after a short visit there, both of them went to General McClellan's house on H Street. They were there told that the general had gone to the wedding of an officer and would soon return. They waited nearly an hour in the drawing room. When McClellan returned, and without paying any especial attention to the orderly who told him the President was waiting to see him, went upstairs. The President, thinking his name had not been announced, again sent a servant to his room and received the answer that he had gone to bed. Mr. Lincoln attached no special importance to this incident, and so far as we know, never asked for an explanation nor received one. But it was not unnatural for him to infer that his frequent visits had become irksome to the general. There was no cessation of their friendly relations, though after this most of their conferences were held at the Executive Mansion. On the 20th of November a grand review of the Army of the Potomac took place at Munson's Hill. There were about 50,000 men in line, drawn up on a wide undulating plain, which displayed them to the best advantage, and a finer army had rarely been seen. The President, accompanied by Generals McClellan and McDowell, and followed by a brilliant cavalcade of 100 general and staff officers, rode up and down the entire extent of the embattled host. Mr. Lincoln was a good horseman, and was received with hearty cheers by the troops, thousands of whom saw him that day for the first and last time. The reviewing officers then took their stand upon a gentle acclivity in the center of the plain, and the troops filed past in review through the autumnal afternoon until twilight. It had certainly all the appearance of a great army ready for battle, and there was little doubt that they would speedily be led into action. But after the review, drilling was resumed. Recruits continued to pour in, to be assigned and equipped and instructed. The general continued his organizing work. Many hours of every day he passed in the saddle, riding from camp to camp with tireless industry, until at last he fell seriously ill, and for several weeks the army rested almost with folded hands, awaiting his recovery. End of section 25. End of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 4, by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Recording by Denise Nordell, Modesto, California.